Welcome to the world of corporate law, where corporate legalities guide economics. One of the fundamental economic concepts affiliated with many corporate laws is free trade, which is essential for markets to function optimally and encourage healthy economic growth. Although free trade can be considered in any industry, let's consider a particularly intriguing current example from the airline industry, where free trade is enforced by contractual agreements known as open skies agreements. Open skies agreements are contractual agreements signed between U.S. and foreign governments and grant airlines in both countries unfettered access to the partner country. Under open skies, carriers from both countries are free to operate as many flights to as many cities in the partner country as are financially viable. Open skies agreements are valid contractual agreements since they meet four requirements. 1. Agreement. The U.S. government offers to enter into this legal agreement and foreign governments accept the offer. 2. Consideration. Promises made by the countries must be supported by something of value, in this case access to fly to the other country. Both countries' governments saw sufficient legal value these agreements could add and therefore negotiated for exchange. 3. Contractual capacity. The contract can be and is actually enforced by the governments involved. 4. Legality. The goal of open skies is to grant legal access to foreign markets. With this in mind, let's also consider that open skies agreements meet the offer from the U.S. government's intention, definitiveness of terms, and communication conditions. It's also important to note that these agreements are initially bilateral, since foreign governments can accept the contract by promising to practice fair trade when entering foreign markets. Once the governments actually establish the new air routes, the contract comes into existence. Before open skies agreements were implemented, flying to certain foreign markets and capturing foreign demand was difficult due to foreign market restrictions. To liberalize markets that had previously been restricted, open skies has been highly successful in opening new markets for U.S. air carriers and promoting competition and consumer choice. In other words, American carriers such as Delta, United, and American are free to fly internationally, and foreign carriers such as Qatar, Etihad, and Emirates can fly routes to the U.S. Consumers are able to choose which airline they would like to fly given factors such as ticket prices, experience, culture, and timing. This splits the total market demand for international routes between multiple suppliers, or airlines in this case. Ultimately, open skies agreements are important because they encourage a supply and demand equilibrium which is necessary for healthy economic growth. Open skies policies are grounded on two foundational concepts. First, promoting liberalization. To do so, government influence is removed from the international aviation marketplace when foreign governments sign the agreements. And second, ensuring that in each individual case, the agreements negotiated under the policy are consistent with U.S. interests. Foreign carriers still benefit by obtaining access to new international markets, which creates new profit opportunities for them. So far, the U.S. has persuaded over 110 foreign governments to sign open skies agreements under the assumption that every open skies agreement encourages U.S. interests by creating the conditions for market-based competition, which is important since it promotes healthy economic growth. In most cases, this assumption has held true. However, in a few extreme cases, the valuable open skies traffic rights that the United States granted have been misused. The most recent and significant cases are the Gulf nations of Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Over the past decade, the governments of Qatar, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai have formulated economic development strategies that largely depend on increasing the total flow of international air passenger traffic through their hub cities. To encourage air traffic through their hub cities, Middle Eastern carriers have created vertically integrated aviation sectors which include establishing a monopoly in the market. This is against the open skies principle of free trade. State-owned Qatar Airways, Etihad Airways, and Emirates Airlines, collectively known as the Gulf carriers, have been key in these initiatives. Their governments have fueled their operations with over $40 billion in subsidies over the last decade alone. To summarize, U.S. carriers are privately owned companies focused on profitability and serving the interests of shareholders, employees, and their communities. Government subsidies have distorted the playing field in favor of the Middle Eastern carriers and made it nearly impossible for U.S. carriers to serve the Middle East from the U.S. This violates the Open Skies agreements, where the U.S. and Middle Eastern governments agreed to enforce these contracts without revoking them. In the summer of 2012, there were 15 daily flights to 9 cities in the U.S. from the UAE and Qatar. 2 U.S. carriers operated 2 of those flights, while 3 Middle Eastern carriers operated the remaining 13 flights. However, Middle Eastern carriers offered low fares and supplied more capacity than the market or the U.S. carriers could bear, resulting in losses for all airlines. The U.S. carriers pulled out of these markets, but the Middle Eastern carriers are continuing to serve the U.S. thanks to the subsidies provided by their governments. In July 2018, there are 28 daily flights to 15 cities in the U.S. from the UAE and Qatar, but none are operated by U.S. carriers. The loss of service by U.S. carriers has resulted in lost jobs in the U.S. To make matters worse, the Middle Eastern carriers are continuing to grow international service. Unlike U.S. and third country carriers, the Gulf carriers are adding this new capacity, all of which will be deployed on international routes at rates that substantially exceed GDP growth, which drives growth in demand for air transport services. Therefore, in order to fill this excess capacity, they must take passengers from other countries' carriers. If this continues, thousands of U.S. jobs could be lost as subsidized Gulf carrier capacity takes passengers and revenue from U.S. airlines. To reach a settlement, the Partnership for Fair and Open Skies, a group including the 3 largest U.S. airlines and several airline unions, approached the U.S. government and intensively campaigned to create awareness of the seriousness of the issue. U.S. carriers won the support of over 300 congressmen. Thereafter, in early 2018, the U.S. government engaged with their counterparts in the UAE to hopefully solve the crisis without lawsuits. The U.S. convinced them to stop the unfair subsidies and agreed to the following without having to rescind the agreements or undergo lawsuits. 1. Freezing Fifth Freedom routes. No new Fifth Freedom routes will be implemented. These are international routes that do not involve any of a carrier's home countries, such as Emirates' route between Milan and New York. Fifth Freedom routes can unfairly drive competition out of the market and destroy U.S. airline jobs. This has been a major victory for U.S. airline workers nationwide. 2. Admitting the unfairness of state subsidies. 3. Requiring transparency. Over the years, Middle Eastern carriers have hidden billions of dollars in subsidies and will now be required to undergo international auditing standards for their financial statements. 4. Unwinding the subsidies. The UAE has agreed to conduct transactions without subsidies, and this will eliminate an unfair advantage subsidies have granted the carriers by their governments. 5th, imposing reasonable airport fees. Finally, the UAE has long manipulated airport fees to give its state-owned airlines an unfair advantage. By endorsing the ICAO guidance for only charging fair airport fees, this practice is terminated. To wrap up, open skies agreements are important government contracts whose effects extend beyond the airline industry to the global economy. By enforcing these agreements properly, free trade is encouraged in proportion with economic growth. Thanks for listening to today's special on open skies agreements. Tune in next time for more exciting business news.